lonely rancher found a starving Apache woman, and without knowing, his future wife. John Parker had lived on the same stretch of land for nearly 10 years, a lonely rancher in the wide, open spaces of the Southwest. His home was a small wooden cabin, weathered and worn by the sun and wind, sitting on a hill that overlooked his fields and the distant mountains. The days were long and quiet, broken only by the low mooing of his cattle or the occasional gust of wind that rattled the windows. He was used to solitude. He had chosen this life after losing his wife years ago, a kind woman who had died young, leaving him with a heart full of grief and a ranch that demanded constant care. Though he missed her every day, John had learned to survive on his own, finding comfort in routine and the wide, empty beauty around him. His mornings began early. He rose before the sun, tying his boots and pulling on his worn coat as he stepped out into the cool air. The sky was often painted in soft oranges and pinks, a quiet promise of the day ahead. He would walk among his cattle, checking fences and gates, mending anything that threatened to fail. The work was hard, but it kept him grounded, and it gave his mind a chance to wander. Sometimes he thought of the life he might have had, of the children he never got to raise, and of the laughter he once knew. Other times, he simply let the silence of the land speak to him, a companion of sorts in his long hours alone. Despite the beauty around him, the land could be harsh. The sun beat down relentlessly, and during summer the dry wind could crack his lips and dry the soil to dust. Water was always a concern, and a single dry spell could mean trouble for his herd. Still, he loved it. There was freedom here, a kind of honest life that demanded strength and patience. He was a man of few words, preferring the company of his animals to people, though he often wondered if he had become too isolated. Sometimes when he sat on the porch at night, watching the stars shimmer in the clear sky, a part of him longed for someone to share it with, someone who could see the world through his eyes and understand the quiet joy of small victories, the birth of a calf, a repaired fence, cool drink of water at sunset. Rumors often drifted through the region about nearby Apache bands and their struggles to survive. John had learned to respect them, knowing that the world they lived in was difficult and full of challenges. He had little contact with them, mostly seeing distant figures on the horizon or hearing stories from traveling merchants and neighboring ranchers. Fear mingled with respect in his mind, a reminder that the world was bigger and more complicated than his small patch of land. He knew that misunderstandings could be dangerous, and he had learned to be careful. Yet, despite the warnings, he also knew that compassion could bridge gaps that fear could not. He simply did not know when, or if, he would ever need to act on that belief. One morning, as John rode his horse along a dry creek bed that cut across his land, he noticed something unusual. At first, it was a flicker of movement, almost imperceptible against the pale earth. He slowed his horse and squinted, shading his eyes from the rising sun. There, half hidden among the rocks and scrub, was a figure, a woman lying on the ground. At first he feared she might be hurt badly or worse, but as he drew closer, he saw her rise slightly, her movements weak and unsteady. Her clothes were torn and dusty, and she seemed to struggle simply to sit upright. Her skin was sunburned, and her eyes held a distant, frightened look that made John's chest tighten. He had never seen someone in such a state before. Cautiously, he dismounted and approached her. His horse shifted nervously, sensing his tension. He called out gently, "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman flinched at his voice, drawing back as if she were ready to run, but she was far too weak to stand. Her lips moved, forming words he could not understand, a language foreign to him. Still, he could see the fear and exhaustion etched into her face. Something inside him stirred, a mix of pity, concern, and something he had not felt in years, the urge to protect. He knelt beside her and held out his hand slowly, trying to show that he meant no harm. After a moment that felt longer than it was, she allowed him to touch her arm. Her skin was hot and dry, and he could feel the tremor of weakness in her small frame. He lifted her carefully into his arms, mindful of her frailty, and carried her back toward his cabin. It was not far, but the sun was high, and the effort made him sweat. His heart ached for her, and he could not shake the thought that she might not survive without help. The land was merciless, and he had seen animals die from far less. He murmured soothing words, hoping she could understand the comfort in his voice even if she could not grasp the words themselves. Once inside the cabin, he laid her on a blanket near the fireplace. He fetched water in a tin cup and a small piece of bread, urging her to eat and drink. At first she could not, but eventually, after gentle coaxing and patience, she took small sips of water. Her breathing slowed and color began to return to her cheeks. John watched her carefully, silently amazed at her resilience. She had endured so much, and yet here she was, still fighting to survive. He prepared a simple meal, keeping it plain and easy to eat, and watched as she ate with trembling hands. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of gratitude perhaps, or understanding, that made John feel a warmth he had not felt in years. Days passed, and the woman grew stronger. She did not speak his language, but they found ways to communicate, gestures, nods, and shared routines. She helped him with small tasks around the cabin, sweeping the floor, fetching water, and even feeding the animals under his guidance. He watched her carefully, noting her cautious movements and sharp instincts. She was not just a survivor, she was clever, quick to notice details, and careful with the cattle. Slowly, a bond formed between them, built on trust, patience, and a shared rhythm of life. John began to look forward to seeing her each day, feeling a connection that went beyond simple responsibility. Evenings were their quietest time together. After the work was done and the animals were settled, they would sit by the fire. The woman would trace patterns in the dust on the floor or gaze out the window at the mountains, and John would watch her silently, speaking softly when words were necessary. He told her stories about the land, about the small joys and challenges of ranch life, and even though she did not always understand, she listened with intent, nodding at certain parts and smiling at moments that seemed to amuse her. John felt something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of companionship, of shared existence. Despite the growing bond, there was a tension in the air, unspoken but ever-present. John was aware of the neighbors' whispers and the judgments that might come if they saw him helping a woman from the Apache community. The world beyond his land could be harsh, quick to judge, and slow to understand, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. He had seen too much suffering, and knew that kindness mattered more than opinion. And he found himself hoping, in ways he had not hoped for years, that she would stay, that their lives could intertwine, and that the solitude he had grown so accustomed to might finally be softened by another presence, someone who could share the burdens and joys of his world. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, John and the woman sat outside on the porch. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and distant pine. She reached out tentatively to touch his hand, a small gesture that spoke volumes. John smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest he had not known for years. In the quiet of the evening, with stars beginning to appear overhead, he felt a flicker of hope. Life, he realized, was unpredictable, capable of bringing people together in the most unexpected ways. And for the first time in a long while, he imagined a future in which he was not alone, a future where he could care for someone and be cared for in return. John Parker's days of solitude were not over yet, but something had changed. The small cabin, once filled only with silence, now held the soft sounds of life and recovery. The land, harsh and demanding as it was, had also brought him a chance encounter that could alter his world forever. And as night settled over the ranch, he sat quietly, watching the stars with a sense of anticipation he could hardly name, feeling that destiny, in its own quiet way, had begun to touch his life. Days passed slowly at John Parker's ranch, but each day brought small changes. The young Apache woman, whom John had not yet learned her name, began to regain strength. Her steps grew steadier, her eyes brighter, and the fear that had clung to her in the beginning softened, though it never fully disappeared. John watched her closely, careful not to rush her recovery. He had seen too many lives lost to impatience or misjudgment, and he had learned that healing required time, patience, and respect. He prepared simple meals for her each day, small portions of bread, milk, and dried meat, carefully softened so that she could eat without effort. At first, she would nibble quietly, glancing at him with wide eyes that reflected both fear and wonder. Slowly, she began to accept the routine, taking her food with a quiet gratitude that needed no words. John had learned to read her gestures and expressions, understanding her moods and needs without a single clear sentence exchanged. It amazed him how much could be communicated through small actions, a look, a nod, a hand extended in trust. She began helping around the cabin when she felt strong enough. She swept the floors, washed dishes in the cold water of the creek, and fed the animals with careful hands. At first, John had only allowed her to do small tasks, watching her constantly, but she proved capable and attentive. Her movements were careful but confident, showing that even in her weakened state, she had an inner strength that demanded respect. John found himself silently admiring her courage. She had endured more in her short life than many could imagine, and yet she carried herself with dignity and resilience. They developed a way of communicating that was simple but effective. John would point to things, speaking slowly, and she would nod, repeating the words as best she could. He learned some of her language in return, and she learned some of his, creating a small bridge between their worlds. Though they were strangers from different cultures, they were learning to understand each other. Laughter began to find its way into the cabin, small, quiet chuckles when a word was mispronounced, or when she tried to mimic a task and almost fell over. These moments were rare but precious, softening the loneliness that had wrapped around John's life like a heavy cloak. Evenings were the most peaceful time of day. After the animals were fed and the chores finished, John would sit by the fire while the woman sat nearby, tracing patterns in the dust or gazing at the flames. They spoke little, yet the silence between them was comfortable, almost comforting. John would sometimes tell stories about his childhood, about the land, and about the cattle, and she would listen with a quiet intensity that told him she understood more than he realized. Her eyes held a mixture of curiosity, intelligence, and a growing trust that filled him with a warmth he had not felt for many years. John noticed small things about her that revealed her character. She was cautious, always aware of her surroundings, yet she was also observant, noticing subtle changes in the environment. A shift in the wind, the approach of an animal, the distant sound of a horse. She moved with careful precision, but there was also a grace in her steps, a rhythm that seemed to belong to the land itself. She had been shaped by hardship, and yet she carried a quiet dignity that impressed John more than words ever could. One morning, as John checked the far side of his pasture, he saw her struggling to lift a bucket of water. He rushed to her side and helped her carry it, gently admonishing her to be careful. She smiled, a faint but genuine expression, and nodded in acknowledgement. That smile lingered in his mind long after the moment passed. He realized that he had begun to depend on these small interactions, that he had begun to care deeply for her well-being in a way he had not expected. Her presence filled the cabin, the land, and even the quiet corners of his heart with a sense of life and purpose he had thought lost forever. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. The woman began to share small details of her life, though much remained a mystery. Through gestures and broken words, she conveyed that she had once lived with her family, that her world had been torn apart, and that she had survived through determination and courage. John listened with a heavy heart, feeling the weight of her experiences, and he offered what comfort he could. He spoke gently, pointing to the cabin and the fields, showing her that she was safe now, that she did not need to fear hunger or danger within these walls. As the days turned into weeks, they began to find a rhythm together. She would wake early to help with chores, and he would often take breaks to show her how to handle the cattle or mend fences. They worked side by side in silence more often than in words, a quiet companionship forming through shared labor. John began to notice subtle changes in her demeanor, confidence replacing hesitation, trust replacing fear, and even a hint of playfulness appearing in the corners of her eyes. He felt a growing admiration for her, but also a quiet, cautious hope, a feeling he had buried long ago. Despite their growing connection, the world outside remained a threat. John knew that neighbors and other ranchers might not understand or accept the woman. He had heard whispers from passing travelers, tales of mistrust and prejudice that were common in the region. But he refused to let those fears dictate his actions. The woman had survived much worse than gossip or suspicion, and he believed that kindness and courage should guide him rather than fear. He silently resolved to protect her, no matter the cost, even if it meant standing alone against a world that might judge him harshly. One evening, a sudden summer storm rolled in. Thunder rumbled across the distant hills, and lightning illuminated the sky in brilliant flashes. Rain began to fall, pounding the roof of the cabin and running in small streams along the dirt path. John hurried outside to secure the animals, and the woman followed, holding a small blanket over her head. She struggled at first, but John guided her, showing her how to handle the sudden weather. As they worked together, soaked and tired, they laughed quietly at their clumsy attempts to stay dry. In that moment, John felt a deep sense of connection, a realization that shared challenges could create bonds stronger than words alone. As the storm subsided and the first stars appeared in the clearing sky, they returned to the cabin. The woman sat near the fire, drying her damp clothes, while John tended to the animals one last time. They ate a simple meal together, the warmth of the fire and the comfort of shared survival creating an intimacy neither had expected. John caught himself watching her closely, noticing the strength in her hands, the determination in her eyes, and the quiet courage that had carried her this far. He realized that he was beginning to care for her deeply, in a way he had not thought possible for many years. In the following weeks, small gestures became their language. She learned to prepare meals more confidently, and he began to teach her simple words in English. She would mimic him, her pronunciation rough but earnest, and he would smile at her efforts, correcting her gently. She taught him a few words in her own language as well, and he listened with interest, fascinated by the sounds and meanings. They laughed together at the mistakes, the mispronunciations, and the moments of misunderstanding, discovering joy in the simplest forms of communication. By the end of the month, she could carry water without help, feed the animals with skill, and even tend to minor injuries among the livestock. John observed her quietly, marveling at her resilience and adaptability. He realized that she was more than a survivor. She was a partner, capable of standing alongside him in the challenges of ranch life. And though words had been few between them, a silent understanding had grown, a bond built on trust, shared effort, and mutual respect. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and purple across the horizon, John and the woman sat on the porch, watching the cattle graze peacefully. She reached out tentatively and placed her hand on his, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. John felt a warmth in his chest, a connection that went beyond survival or duty. In that quiet moment, he realized that life had given him a second chance, not only to care for someone, but to be cared for in return. He felt a hope that had been long buried, a hope that perhaps the loneliness he had accepted as inevitable could be replaced by companionship, love, and trust. As the stars appeared in the night sky, glittering like scattered diamonds over the rugged landscape, John felt a quiet peace. The woman had begun to trust him, to share in the life he had built, and in doing so, she had begun to change his world. The cabin, once a place of solitude and quiet routine, now hummed with life, resilience, and the beginnings of something more profound. John Parker, the lonely rancher, had found in her a presence that promised not just survival, but a connection that might last a lifetime. And as the night settled over the ranch, he knew that their journey was only beginning. The land remained harsh, the world beyond still uncertain, but within the walls of the cabin, something rare and precious had taken root. Trust, care, and the faint, steady spark of hope that perhaps destiny had brought them together for a reason. Weeks turned into months, and the young Apache woman, who John had come to think of as more than a stranger, continued to regain her strength. Her hair, once tangled and dusty, was brushed and tied back neatly. Her clothes, though simple, were cleaned and mended. She moved with purpose now, tending the animals, helping John with repairs, and even taking on tasks that once seemed impossible for her weakened frame. The cabin had become more than a shelter. It was now a home filled with activity, laughter, and a quiet sense of routine that both comforted and challenged them. John watched her closely as she worked, often from a distance, letting her demonstrate her abilities. He admired how quickly she adapted, how carefully she measured each step, how thoughtfully she learned the rhythms of ranch life. It amazed him that someone who had endured so much pain could still find the strength to move forward with patience and dignity. At times he caught her looking at him with curiosity, and he would feel a strange warmth in his chest, a gentle pull that was neither fear nor obligation, but something far deeper. The woman had begun to speak a few words in English, her pronunciation rough but determined. John encouraged her, repeating words slowly and praising her efforts. In return, she taught him a few words in her own language, pointing to objects and making sounds that he tried to imitate. They laughed often at the mistakes, finding humor in the tiny miscommunications that arose daily. These small exchanges became a bridge between their worlds, allowing them to share ideas, feelings, and even dreams in ways that went beyond words. Their companionship extended beyond chores. In the mornings, they would sometimes ride together across the land, checking on distant cattle or inspecting fences. The sun would rise behind them, casting long shadows across the fields, and in those quiet moments, neither felt the need to speak. The wind carried the scent of dry grass, and the distant mountains stood like silent guardians over their lives. John began to feel something he had thought lost forever, a sense of connection, not only to the woman but to the land itself, as if both were teaching him how to be part of a world larger than himself. At night, after the work was done and the animals were fed, they would sit together by the fire. The woman had started to show small signs of playfulness, teasing John gently or mimicking his expressions. He would shake his head and laugh, feeling the tension of long years of loneliness ease from his shoulders. Sometimes she would trace patterns on the dusted floor or pick up a scrap of wood to carve small shapes, and he would watch her quietly, admiring the concentration and creativity she displayed. These evenings became a sacred time, a space where words were not always necessary, yet feelings could be shared in every glance and gesture. John noticed her bravery in small, quiet ways. One morning, while inspecting the far pasture, she noticed a calf stuck in a muddy gully. Without hesitation, she waded in, pulling at the struggling animal while John guided her from the edge. She got wet, muddy, and tired, but she never wavered. When the calf finally broke free and ran toward its mother, she laughed softly, brushing mud from her hands. John felt a surge of admiration and gratitude. She was strong, resourceful, and unafraid to face challenges head-on, and he realized that she had begun to fill a space in his life that he had thought would remain empty forever. Despite the growing closeness, there were moments of tension and misunderstanding. One day, John caught her flinching when he raised his voice slightly, and he realized that even in their shared trust, her past experiences had left deep marks. He approached her gently, speaking slowly, assuring her that she was safe and that he would never harm her. She nodded quietly, her eyes glistening with unspoken gratitude and relief. It was a reminder to John that trust was earned, not demanded, and that patience was the key to nurturing the bond they were building. Their days were full of small joys, like watching the sun rise over the mountains, sharing a simple meal, or discovering wildflowers along the creek. John began to notice subtle changes in his own behavior. He spoke more often than he had in years, laughed more freely, and even found himself thinking of her when she was not around. He realized that her presence had begun to reshape his life, softening the edges of his loneliness and filling the cabin with warmth he had long forgotten. He was careful, however, to keep his feelings quiet, respecting the fragile trust they had nurtured. One afternoon, while repairing a fence along the ridge, a sudden storm rolled in. The sky darkened quickly, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. Lightning flashed across the horizon, and thunder rumbled like the growl of a distant beast. The woman struggled to carry supplies back to the cabin, but John guided her, showing her how to stay safe and steady. They laughed softly at the chaos, finding comfort in their teamwork and shared struggle. By the time they reached the cabin, soaked and tired, they were laughing so freely that it felt like the first real moment of carefree joy they had experienced together. As the weeks passed, John began to teach her small skills beyond the daily chores. He showed her how to mend fences properly, how to care for sick animals, and how to track signs in the land that predicted weather changes. She absorbed everything eagerly, demonstrating intelligence and adaptability that impressed him daily. In turn, she shared her own knowledge, plants that could be used for minor ailments, ways to find edible roots and herbs, and methods of survival learned from her family. These exchanges strengthened their connection, blending two worlds into one shared life that was gradually becoming more than survival. It was becoming a partnership. Their bond deepened further when a neighbor came by one evening. John had warned her to stay inside, but she peeked from the cabin doorway, curiosity flickering in her eyes. The neighbor asked after John, mentioning the woman in a tone that was both cautious and judgmental. John stepped forward, defending her quietly but firmly. He noticed her hesitation, her slight pull back from the doorway, and realized how fragile the trust between them still was in the eyes of the outside world. Yet, he felt proud of her courage, of how she had faced not just the land, but the judgment of others with quiet dignity. Over time, small gestures became their unspoken language. She would bring him a fresh cup of water without being asked, and he would catch her glancing at him with a shy but unmistakable warmth. He noticed the way she lingered near him during chores, her hand brushing accidentally against his, or the way her laughter seemed to echo in the cabin long after it was spoken. John, in turn, began to offer her small comforts, a warmer blanket, a piece of fruit, or simply a reassuring smile when she struggled with a task. They were learning the subtle art of care, a delicate dance of attention and consideration that went beyond words and built a foundation of love without anyone admitting it aloud. One evening, under the wide open sky, they sat outside after a long day of work. The stars began to appear, sparkling like distant fires, and the woman pointed upward, tracing patterns with her finger. John followed her gesture, trying to see the shapes she saw. She smiled, her eyes reflecting the starlight, and for a moment, John felt the world shrink to just the two of them. He realized that he was no longer thinking of her as a stranger or a survivor needing help. She had become someone essential, someone whose presence had transformed the rhythm of his life, someone who had touched the deepest part of his heart without even trying. Even as their connection grew, John remained cautious. He knew that the world outside the ranch could be cruel, that prejudice and fear could bring trouble if others learned too much about their growing closeness. But he also knew that he could not turn back now, that he had found something rare and precious, and that protecting it mattered more than any judgment or danger. He watched her carefully, noticing her habits, her small joys, and even the ways she adjusted to life on the ranch. Every day brought new revelations, new admiration, and a quiet, steady pull toward a life he had not dared to imagine in years. By the end of the season, the woman had become a true partner in the ranch's daily life. She could handle the animals, care for the cabin, and even help with repairs that John had once believed required strength and experience he alone possessed. Their days were filled with work, yes, but also with quiet moments of companionship, laughter, and mutual respect. The cabin no longer felt empty, the land no longer silent. And at night, when the stars shone above, John often found himself stealing glances at her, wondering how he could have gone so long without such a presence, such courage, such life in his home. And though neither of them spoke of it directly, both felt the unspoken bond that had grown between them. The trust, care, and understanding they had nurtured over months had transformed into something deeper. John had found not only a companion, but someone who could challenge him, comfort him, and share his world in a way that no one else ever had. And she in turn had found a refuge, a place of safety, and a man whose quiet strength and patience allowed her to heal not just physically, but emotionally. As the season turned toward winter, John and the woman stood together on the porch, watching the fading light of the day touch the mountains with soft gold. The wind was cool against their faces, carrying the scent of dry grass and pine. They did not speak, for words were not necessary. The land had witnessed their struggles, their small victories, and the growing closeness between them. And in that quiet moment, both felt the stirrings of a future that neither could yet name, but both hoped for, a life shared, a bond unbroken, and a connection that had begun with nothing more than compassion and the chance of a single encounter. The months rolled on, and life on John Parker's ranch had settled into a rhythm, yet a tension lingered beneath the surface. The Apache woman, now stronger and more confident than ever, had become an essential part of the ranch. She handled chores with skill, cared for the animals with diligence, and even helped John plan for the winter months. But the world beyond the boundaries of their land remained unpredictable and at times unwelcoming. Whispers from neighbors had begun to reach John, subtle comments about the woman at his cabin and speculation about her presence. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the work and their growing bond, but he could not pretend that judgment did not exist. One morning, as John tended to the farthest pasture, he noticed tracks in the dirt that suggested someone had passed near the cabin during the night. His heart tightened. He had warned her to remain cautious, but now he realized that danger was not only in wild animals or the harsh land, it could come from people as well. He returned quickly, finding the woman sweeping the porch. Her eyes lifted at his approach, a faint worry flickering across her face. John reassured her with a nod, silently promising that he would protect her no matter what. She smiled weakly, trusting him, though he could see that her past had left scars that no amount of safety could erase. That afternoon, a neighboring rancher, Mr. Harris, came by. He was a tall, imposing man with a face lined by sun and worry, and he carried a quiet air of judgment. He asked after John's health and then cautiously inquired about the woman. His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, a suspicion that John had welcomed trouble to his doorstep. John answered carefully, explaining that she had been found in the wild, weak and starving, and that he had taken her in to save her life. Harris raised an eyebrow, muttering something under his breath about the dangers of trusting strangers. The woman, watching from the doorway, stiffened slightly, uncertainty in her eyes. John placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, silently telling her that she was safe. After Harris left, John and the woman spoke in quiet tones. Through gestures and the few words they shared, he explained that the outside world could be harsh and that they must be careful. She nodded, understanding more than he realized, and together they worked to fortify the cabin and maintain a low profile. John began to feel a growing sense of responsibility, not just for her survival, but for her safety in a world that did not always accept outsiders. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but it was also a commitment he did not regret. Life on the ranch continued with its usual tasks, but small conflicts tested their patience and courage. One day, a group of ranchers came by, arguing loudly about water rights and grazing land. The woman had never encountered such disputes before, and the tension frightened her. John guided her inside the cabin, shielding her from the confrontation, but the noise and anger outside made both of them aware that their peaceful life was fragile. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the woman spoke softly, pointing to herself and then to the land, trying to express the fear she felt about being unwelcome in a place that had begun to feel like home. John held her hand, comforting her silently, knowing that words alone could not convey the promise he felt in his heart, to keep her safe, to keep her with him, and to protect the life they were building together. The bond between them continued to deepen. John noticed her small acts of care, placing fresh water near him when he returned from the fields, fixing his coat if it was torn, or quietly helping the animals during the night. He, in turn, offered gestures of support, covering her with blankets on cold nights, sharing the warmth of the fire, and teaching her how to handle emergencies on the ranch. Every small action strengthened the trust and love growing between them. They were learning not only to survive together but to live together, finding joy in daily routines and comfort in each other's presence. One afternoon, while mending a fence along the ridge, John noticed her pause and gaze at the distant hills. She traced the contours of the land with her finger, her expression a mixture of longing and sadness. He realized that she was thinking of her past, family, home, and the world she had lost. He approached gently, speaking softly, trying to offer reassurance. She looked at him, her eyes glistening, and for a moment he saw the depth of her pain. John felt a surge of empathy and determination. He knew that he could not erase her past, but he could provide a life of safety, trust, and care. And in that moment, he silently promised that he would do everything in his power to keep her with him, to protect the fragile bond they were nurturing. Winter approached, and the land grew colder and more demanding. Snow dusted the hills, and the wind cut sharply across the plains. The woman learned to gather firewood, store food, and prepare the cabin for the harsher months. John watched her skillfully adapt, realizing that she had become indispensable not only in work but in companionship. They shared moments of laughter and warmth, playing small games by the fire, telling stories and learning more of each other's worlds. Despite the harshness outside, the cabin became a sanctuary, a place where fear and loneliness could not intrude. However, not all challenges came from the environment. One day, John received a letter from a distant relative, reminding him of family obligations and suggesting that he should consider marriage to a local woman. The words struck him, a reminder of the world beyond his land, a world that might never accept the woman he had saved and grown to care for deeply. He kept the letter private, understanding that the choice before him was not only about survival or convenience, but about the life he wanted to live, the bond he had nurtured, and the woman who had become his companion in every meaningful way. The woman, sensing his concern though not fully understanding, stayed close to him. She offered small gestures of support, bringing him water while he worked, tying his coat and sharing quiet smiles that communicated more than words ever could. John realized that she had begun to love him in her own way, through actions and silent understanding, and he felt a deep, protective affection in return. The bond they had built through months of trust, work, and shared hardship had blossomed into something neither could ignore, something that required courage to acknowledge and defend. One evening, a harsh wind rattled the cabin, bringing with it the scent of approaching snow. John and the woman sat by the fire, the silence between them comfortable yet full of meaning. He reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth and life within it. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. In that quiet moment, neither spoke, yet both understood the truth that had grown between them, the bond of companionship, trust, and emerging love that had taken root over months of shared experience. External pressures continued to test them. Neighbors' whispers persisted, and the fear of prejudice remained ever present. John knew that they could not remain isolated forever. The world beyond the ranch might not accept their partnership. Yet he also knew that he could not abandon her, could not let fear dictate their lives. He had seen her courage, her resilience, and her intelligence. She had survived hunger, fear, and loss, and now she had found a place where she belonged. And he had found someone who had awakened his heart, softened his solitude, and become the partner he had longed for without knowing it. As winter deepened, they faced practical challenges together. Heavy snow made travel difficult, and they had to plan carefully for supplies. The woman learned to chop firewood efficiently, store food, and anticipate weather changes, proving herself a capable partner in every sense. John watched her with pride and admiration, realizing that she had transformed not only the cabin but his own understanding of life and partnership. Together, they could face hardship, and together, they could create a life filled with trust, care, and mutual respect. In quieter moments, they shared stories of their pasts. She revealed fragments of her life before the hardships, describing her family, the land she had known, and the skills she had learned. John listened intently, offering comfort where he could, and learning more about the strength and resilience that had carried her through so much. In return, he shared stories of his own past, of loss, of work on the ranch, and of the loneliness that had once consumed him. These exchanges deepened their understanding of each other, creating a bond that was emotional, intellectual, and practical, a connection that could withstand both external and internal challenges. By the end of winter, it was clear to both of them that their lives had become inseparable. The woman had become a partner, a confidant, and someone whose presence John could not imagine living without. And she, in turn, had found in him safety, care, and the beginnings of love that had been absent from her life for too long. Their bond, forged in hardship, patience, and shared effort, had grown stronger than either had expected. As the snow melted and spring approached, John and the woman stood on the porch together, looking over the land they had cared for through harsh months. The sun touched the hills with soft gold, and the air carried the fresh scent of new growth. Neither spoke, for words were unnecessary. The bond they had nurtured through months of struggle, trust, and quiet companionship was evident in every gesture, every glance, and every small act of care. And in that moment, both felt the certainty that the life they had begun to build together could endure, even against the challenges that lay ahead. Spring arrived with a gentle warmth that spread across John Parker's ranch, melting the last patches of snow and filling the air with the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers. The land, once harsh and unyielding through winter, seemed to awaken alongside them, carrying a promise of renewal and hope. John and the Apache woman worked together to repair fences, plant small gardens, and prepare for the new season. Each task was lighter than before, not because the work itself had changed, but because they faced it side by side. Their partnership, forged in struggle and strengthened through trust, had transformed both the ranch and their lives. The woman had grown confident in every aspect of ranch life. She could handle the animals, tend the crops, and anticipate the weather with an intuition that impressed even John. He watched her often, quietly amazed at how much she had accomplished in the months since he had found her near the dry creek. She moved with grace and determination, her once cautious steps now sure and deliberate. John, in turn, had learned patience, empathy, and the quiet joy of companionship. The loneliness that had defined his years on the ranch had faded, replaced by a connection that was steady, warm, and unshakable. They had begun to understand each other in ways that words alone could not capture. Small gestures, a shared glance, a hand resting on the other's shoulder, a smile at a simple joke, carried meanings deeper than language. At times, the woman would laugh softly at his expressions, mimicking him in ways that made him chuckle and shake his head. John had learned to respond not just with words but with actions, offering a warm blanket, a steadying hand, or a reassuring touch when the world outside felt threatening. In this quiet, consistent communication, they had discovered a language of care and trust that surpassed the need for spoken words. One morning, as the sun rose over the distant hills, they walked together across the fields, inspecting the cattle and checking fences. The woman paused, crouching to examine a small plant, and pointed to it, demonstrating knowledge of its use. John nodded, impressed at her attention to detail and understanding of the land. For a moment, they stood side by side in silence, feeling the warmth of the sun and the gentle breeze. The world beyond the ranch, with its worries, judgments, and fears, seemed distant and unimportant. Here together, they had created a life that was both simple and profound, a life rooted in respect, understanding, and care for one another. Their growing bond did not go unnoticed by the few neighbors who occasionally passed by. Rumors still circulated, but John had grown confident in his choices. He no longer feared judgment, knowing that the woman's presence on his ranch was not a matter of convenience or charity. It was a partnership, born of mutual respect, courage, and trust. The occasional curious glance or whisper was now met with quiet assurance. He had learned that living authentically and with integrity mattered far more than the opinions of others. By late spring, John realized that their partnership had grown into something deeper. He had come to care for the woman not only as a companion or a helper, but as someone whose presence he could not imagine living without. He noticed the way she looked at him in quiet moments, her eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity, gratitude, and warmth. Her laughter, once soft and tentative, now rang freely, a sound that filled the cabin with life and reminded him daily of the joy she had brought into his world. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a long day of work, John reached for her hand. The gesture was gentle, unassuming, but it carried the weight of months of shared experience, struggle, and trust. She did not pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand softly, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. The stars began to appear, scattered across the wide open sky like tiny lanterns. They sat together in silence, letting the beauty of the night speak for them, and in that moment, both understood that their lives were now intertwined in a way neither could have anticipated when they first met. As the weeks passed, John and the woman continued to build their life together. They repaired the cabin, planted more crops, and worked to expand their small ranch. The land, once a challenge to survive on, now felt like a place of opportunity and growth. Their cooperation and mutual respect had transformed the ranch into a home that was productive, warm, and filled with life. Even in the quiet moments, they found joy in one another's company, watching the sun rise over the mountains, laughing at the antics of the cattle, or simply sitting together on the porch, feeling the breeze and the calm of the land. John also began to see the deeper changes in himself. The fear, grief, and loneliness that had defined so many years were gradually replaced by hope, care, and the anticipation of shared life. He had learned patience, empathy, and the importance of trust. Most importantly, he had learned to love again, not in haste or expectation, but in quiet, steady moments that were earned through mutual respect and understanding. The woman had brought him back to life in ways he had not thought possible, and he cherished her presence more deeply than words could express. She, too, had grown in confidence and spirit. No longer the frightened, starving woman he had found months earlier, she had become a strong, capable partner. She navigated the ranch with skill, tended to the animals with care, and shared in the responsibilities of daily life. Yet beyond her practical abilities, she had developed a deep emotional bond with John. She trusted him completely, relying on him not just for survival but for companionship, comfort, and protection. In return, John offered her a safe space, respect, and the beginnings of love that had been absent from her life for too long. Together, they had created a balance, a life rooted in equality, trust, and shared effort. As summer approached, the warmth of the sun encouraged the growth of both the land and their relationship. They spent long days in the fields, tending to crops, fixing fences, and watching over the cattle. The woman would often laugh at small mistakes or playful moments, and John would respond with quiet smiles, enjoying the lightness she brought to his life. Their evenings were filled with stories, laughter, and sometimes thoughtful silence as they sat on the porch, watching the sky darken and the stars appear. In these moments, they both felt the profound comfort of companionship, a life shared, a bond strengthened, and a connection that had grown from a single act of kindness months earlier. The woman began to speak more confidently in English, and John continued to learn from her words as well. Together, they shared stories of the past, dreams for the future, and hopes that went beyond the immediate demands of ranch life. They discussed plans for expanding the garden, caring for the livestock through the coming seasons, and perhaps even welcoming visitors to the ranch in the future. Through these conversations, they discovered not only shared responsibilities but shared dreams. Their partnership had become a foundation on which a life could be built, a life filled with love, trust, and resilience. One evening, a distant relative of John's came to visit, curious about the woman he had taken in. Initially, there was a moment of tension as the visitor observed her closely, perhaps expecting to see someone in need or dependent. But as they watched her move confidently, care for the animals, and interact with John with ease and respect, any doubt disappeared. The relative smiled, realizing that she had become an integral part of the ranch in John's life. The moment marked a quiet triumph, not one of confrontation or words, but of living proof that their bond was real, strong, and deserving of respect. By the end of summer, it was clear that their lives were inseparable. The woman had become not only a partner but a friend, confidant, and the source of a new sense of joy and purpose in John's life. John, in turn, had become her protector, teacher, and companion in ways that gave her confidence, safety, and a sense of belonging. Together, they faced challenges with courage, shared victories with laughter, and built a life filled with quiet, meaningful moments. The cabin, once a place of loneliness, was now alive with warmth, care, and shared experience. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting the fields in golden light, John and the woman stood together on the porch. They watched the cattle graze peacefully, the wind carrying the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers. John reached for her hand and she placed hers in his. Neither spoke at first. Words were unnecessary. In the silence, they understood the depth of their connection, the trust, care, and love that had grown from months of hardship, patience, and shared life. They had found in each other not only companionship, but the promise of a future built together, one day at a time. As night fell, the stars spread across the sky like scattered lanterns. The woman traced constellations with her finger, and John followed her gesture, smiling quietly at her wonder and curiosity. They sat together in the quiet, listening to the distant sounds of the land, feeling the calm that comes from belonging, and savoring the knowledge that their bond had endured challenges, hardship, and uncertainty. They had built something rare and precious, a life together rooted in trust, respect, and love. Years later, when they looked back on the events that had brought them together, neither would forget the day John had found the woman starving near the creek. That single act of compassion had set in motion a journey that neither could have anticipated, a journey that had transformed two lonely lives into a shared existence full of hope, resilience, and love. The ranch, once a place of solitude and struggle, had become a home, a sanctuary, and a testament to the power of trust, care, and courage. John Parker and the Apache woman, once strangers brought together by circumstance, had become partners in every sense of the word. Together they faced the world, nurtured the land, and discovered a life richer and more fulfilling than either could have imagined. And on quiet nights, under the endless sky filled with stars, they would sit together, hand in hand, knowing that destiny had brought them together for a reason, and that the life they had built was only the beginning of their story.